Hey guys, Phil here, Zon Master, Ruby on Rails development, etc, etc. And today is another part of my look at ElasticSearch. This is kind of a catch-all episode that has some just bits and bobs about using ElasticSearch that I thought you might want to know. And just look over here at my notes. What I'm going to do, there's 5 things maybe I'm going to look into here. One is non-ActiveRecord models and using those with Elasticsearch. Looking at presenters, which is not really about Elasticsearch, but just something I use to incorporate Elasticsearch. Some quick little tip about using Elasticsearch and caching, or using Elasticsearch as a cache and so on. And then some other stuff about, setting the index name and adding new fields. Let's dive into it and switch over and take a look at the old computer. I'm using the same app that I used in part 1, or created in part 1, which you can get off GitHub. And just my chair, get ready. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is non-ActiveRecord models and Elasticsearch. I think as Rails developers, we think a lot about only ActiveRecord, and sometimes you don't always use it like that. Let me explain again a little bit about how my philosophy is, for using databases with bigger projects. I kind of have 3 components to everything. One is this core database that is kind of like a data store. And that's where all the data comes in that gets ingested. A lot of the work I do is pulling in data from various APIs, mashing it up, for want of a better word. So pulling all that raw data in, and that goes into the database store. I can flip over it for a second. That goes into this database store. Typically I use MySQL for that, but sometimes I use PostgreSQL, depends on my mood. Then that data kind of gets denormalized and put into Elasticsearch, and Elasticsearch drives the front end. Also driving the front end will be your regular caches like Redis or Memcache and things like that. So that's kind of the flow of data into the data store, up to Elasticsearch, and into the front end. Now sometimes you do secondary munging of that data, and it doesn't necessarily go into an object that is directly related to the data store. For instance, in the data store, MySQL, I have a orders object, and I have an orders object or document or whatever you want to call it inside of Elasticsearch. But sometimes you want to create a statistics thing because you're always messing around with the stats and everything like that. You don't need to put that in the MySQL database because it's kind of pulled out of various tables of MySQL, and you're going to create a new object and only put it in Elasticsearch. And that's what I'm talking about doing. So how would I do that? So first of all, let's create a plain old, I've done it already, but I'm just going to use that as a reference so you can watch me type. It's a order stat, let's call it that, .rb. And we're going to create a class. I put it in my Elasticsearch module. So Elasticsearch order stat. I find my typing is absolutely horrible these days. We've got an initialize, and maybe we're going to have some attributes here, like these are not stats, but I'm going to put them in there anyway. Title, label, price, no, average price, let's say. So let's say you've got those things, you initialize them with some args, and you put the title. The args. Jeez, what am I doing? Title, label, average price. Okay, for sake of argument, we're going to do that. So we've got our order stat, it's a plain old Ruby object. How does this actually connect to Elasticsearch? What you need to do is make this object kind of have its own Elasticsearch repository. When we create an active record object and we use Elasticsearch Rails and we do this thing, which is include Elasticsearch model, include Elasticsearch model callbacks, one of the things that this does is give us a repository object, and these fields here like settings, that is working on the repository object. So we're not using these because these are Rails only things. We're using our own. So what we're going to do first of all is create a repository. I'm going to copy this out because I don't want to waste your time. So we have a repository, and we need some kind of connection to the repository. So yeah, what we need to do is use this Elasticsearch mixin, which is the persistence repository. This is found in the Elasticsearch persistence gem, which is automatically included when you install Elasticsearch Rails. So we're going to include that. It's a bit silly that they do it like this, but because all you do is exactly this, just create a module with your class name, Elasticsearch repository, you include their mixin, and you're done. You don't do anything else. I've actually never seen anybody write any code in here, but maybe people do who are smarter than me, I don't know. So that's the Elasticsearch repository, and the repository is Elasticsearch database. This is the object that communicates with that database. So we've created our Elasticsearch ES repository new. We pass in the same client that we're using. This is the client that we created in the previous episode. Elasticsearch RB, if you remember this, I just created a new client to add some logging. So we're using that same client that we assigned to model client. I'm going to create I've done this several times today, order stats, and the class is order stat. And you do this, so, okay, first of all, it knows what index you're talking to. You assign it a type, not quite sure what that does. And you assign it a class, and that way when it pulls the data out of Elasticsearch, it knows what object to instantiate. This is all done automatically for you when you're doing it in Rails and you're using an active record model and you're mirroring an active record model directly. Again, this is for when you want to have a model that is only inside of Elasticsearch, not inside of your root database or whatever. So then we do the settings. What's that silly thing? Yeah, we'll just copy this stuff out of here. So then we, on the repository object, so this will look very familiar to you because this is the same kind of thing that we did on the active Rails object. We didn't need to put the repository here because we had this model mixed in, gave us a repository. So we have just the settings. We set the title, label, and average price. Now label will do a keyword, and this again defines in the Elasticsearch mapping what these columns fields actually mean. So there is our non-active record object. So when we create that, hopefully this works. What is it? Elasticsearch order stat. I wonder if I have, nah, forget about that. Order stat. Ooh. Elasticsearch order stat new. And what was it? Title, test1, label, electronics, average price, 10.99. Let's see if that works. Yeah, camel. There we go. Now, how do we get it actually into the repository? Well, I like to just define a save method because then it's kind of a bit like an active record. And what we do is we grab our order stat repository. See, this is the method we created here, self repository. So we create the grab the repository, we say save, we pass in ourselves, and that should, I'm gonna have to recreate this, reload. Let's create that order stat now. God willing, when we say order stat save, now when we try and save it, it doesn't save. So why is that? Because we need a toHash method. Now a ActiveRail object, active model object always has, you get a lot of methods chucked onto your thing when you inherit from active record. And one of those is a toHash method, which ends up calling as index.json, which is why we override as index.json. So what we can do is add a toHash method. And what I just like to do is define my fields here, label, average price, and then map, what is that? This. We pass in the method name, which will be one of these, method name, send method name. And because we've created readers, we need to create an ID. And let's create an ID here. Equals, need something unique-ish. So what we can do is title dash, need one of those, time.current.toI. That'll do for now. So we add these 4 things on here, backwards, and now it'll call the toHash. So let's reload, let's create that object again, let's save it. And there we go. It's done a put to that order stats index. So it's created that order stats index. It's added some stuff, the ID, which we passed, the title, the label, and the price. So that's all in there. So that's how you put a non-active record object into Elasticsearch by creating your own, adding your repository. Let's quickly go over the steps. Create the plain old Ruby object. Add the repository method, which uses your own repository to connect to the Elasticsearch instance. Create a save method. Create a toHash to put those values into a hash and save it into the database. And we could go over and look, but I'm not going to do that right now. It's going on a bit long. So that's how we add our non-active record. Let's talk for a second about presenters. Sometimes, especially like when we're talking about, we could be using the ElasticSearch version of an order, for example, or we could be using the raw database version, MySQL version of an order. So what I like to do is create a presenter, and a presenter is a very simple object, order presenter Let's just quickly do one of these. I'm going to do it with an initialize because I need it. Order presenter. I like to use something which is the presentation model pattern, not the presentation pattern. They're slightly different. Presentation model pattern, which is the base object. And then if the base object is, so we set that, we have a reader here, attribute reader base object. And the base object could be, it might be a, active record is a active record model. Then we want to wrap a normalizer around there, order denormalizer actually, which is what we would really use to save something to the database, because we're talking about the active record representation in Elasticsearch. So we would do that. Otherwise, we would simply put in the base object because it's come out of it's come out of Elasticsearch already. So I hope that's clear. Let me explain. We have the raw data store, which sometimes we use to drive the front end, and we have the Elasticsearch instance. Normally, we should always be using the Elasticsearch instance, but there are times maybe when we're not. And we need to, I like to put an object in the middle there, which is a presenter. And a presenter is something that the view calls to get the view methods. So and then what you can do is you can write a whole bunch of methods on here. So maybe in the denormalizer, you have something like order items names, which is a list of all the names of the products that are in the order. Now, in the one in Elasticsearch, maybe you denormalize that data and it's already in there in Elasticsearch, and you have something called order items names. But maybe if you're using the one out of the raw database, you don't do that. So you're going to have to go through all of the order items, and map, and grab the name of all the products there or whatever. Actually, what would it be? Order items, item. Hopeless, but not doing this for real anyway. Here's the order item. And then what we want to do is all the items that are in there, map, and grab their name. And then we would just flatten that. So that would give us a list of all the names of the items in there. That it may not be that, the order denormalizer would give that to us. So we need to create this object that sits in the middle. So the order denormalizer will already do that. The Elasticsearch object will already have it. So we need something that calls each way depending on what happens. So that's the presentation model. I like to use that a lot. The other thing is I just wanted to talk for a second about caching. Sometimes you put stuff into Elasticsearch, and if it's not there, like you do with Memcache, if it's not there, you want to create it. I have this little line of code. You can go onto the GitHub repository and pull that down. But basically what it does is it goes out, it does the search, and if that's exactly what the problem was. It goes out, it finds the record. If the record is not there, then you go off and do it. And that's because you can do this nice little comparison. Let's quickly take a look at it. So, you say, product equals product.search and your query. And that may or may not return something. So first thing you want to do is see if it returns. And you do that by looking at the results and first. And so that may end up being nil, right? Because there isn't anything there. It didn't come back. But you can wrap that whole thing in an if. So if product equals product search query results first nil, and then it's doing this nil comparison on this assignment. It's actually checking that. And then so if it's nil, then you go off and you do your stuff, and you can assign product here to B, do your stuff. And then when you come out of it, product will either be the one that you pulled from Elasticsearch or the one that you did your stuff on, which presumably you would have saved into Elasticsearch at the end of doing your stuff. I hope that's clear. That's my little caching tip. And then finally, two things about using Elasticsearch and changing, because we're always adding new fields. Things are different. Things change. So what I'm in the process right now with my, I have this website that's about COVID-19 data. And after a year and something of running this website, I realized I wasn't really putting the data the right way into Elasticsearch. But it's a lot of data. So I can't re-index right now. I mean, re-indexing would take a week. So what do? Let's look at product stat for that. No. Let's look at an active record one because it's actually an active record. So when you use these mix-ins here from Elasticsearch, one of the things it does is it creates an index, because we don't have to do that anywhere in here, that thing that we were doing by hand. It creates an index by default that is the pluralized name of your model. So there will be an index in Elasticsearch called purchase orders, for instance, just like in MySQL. Same kind of thing. So what I do as a way of migrating massive changes is I change this. So I would call it, purchase orders 2021. And I will create another machine with the exact same code, except it has a different index, and the stuff that needs to be done in Elasticsearch is being done. So it's a fork, kind of a halfway. It's not yet using this data for presentation, but it's using this data to put it into the database. So we put that in there, we change the index name, and I re-index. So now we have another machine using the same data and writing into a new index in Elasticsearch, puts all of that information in there. You can take as long as you want. We'll just run on the old way of doing things. We've run on it for a year. We can run on it for another week. Re-index everything into this new index. In the meantime, of course, we're doing development. We're sure that everything is right. And then when the re-indexing is done, on the live branch, we change the index name also to be purchase orders 2021. You could change the index name inside of Elasticsearch, but I found that to be not so effective. So I actually changed production to point to the new index and then delete the old index out of Elasticsearch, so we regain that disk space, which you wouldn't have done in MySQL. You wouldn't regain it, but you do in Elasticsearch. So there, we've renamed the index and re-indexed all the data without affecting live until we really need to. That's thing number one. Thing number two is sometimes you add a new field. Like maybe we decided that we wanted to index on ship to region, for instance, and that's a type of keyword, so we can, North America, Europe, whatever. So we've added a new index. How do we do that? We can, if we don't push it properly into Elasticsearch, this field will end up wrong. In this case, it might by default end up as a keyword, but if it was something like it was a float, like if it was region taxes, that was a float, there's no way Elasticsearch is going to figure that out. It's going to think it's a string. and then you're in deep trouble. It's a waste of a thing, and then you're going to have to do all kinds of stuff. So what we need to do is push that into ElasticSearch before we try and put any data into it. So we need to take this model, we need to add the index, and then we need to call this little bit of code. An article, of course, would be replaced with purchase order in this case. We want to call the client, which is that connection to the repository, and use the put mapping, which is telling ElasticSearch what the mapping is of all the fields in our index. We add the index name, we add the document type, and then we do this mappings to hash, which actually is this big thing in here. And it will push all that information up to Elasticsearch, and if there's a new field, it will create that field with the right type. And then we're golden from there. We can update the code, put the code live, and start putting data into that index, into that field, and everything will be fine, and we can use that field. Now, of course, old records won't have anything in there. You can re-index if you really want, if you really need that information. Otherwise, you should take that into account on your code that you don't have it. Anyway, this is my little sum up. Nobody's going to like this video. It's too rambling, but sometimes there's just these little bits, so I just put them all in here. So there's all these little bits. I don't know, maybe should I write a book about Elasticsearch and Rails? I don't know. Somebody else has probably already done that. But those are all the things. I really love Elasticsearch. It's so powerful, and it's so easy to use, and gives you a lot of things that are very difficult to do, I find, in a MySQL database. The denormalization, the expense of it is, quite low. And so yeah, I pull everything from the front end out of Elasticsearch. That's my little ramble today. I'm learning so much by doing these videos, even if you're not, I am. So thank you for watching, those of you who watch it. I'm motivated to do these videos even if nobody watches, but I'm grateful that people do. So like it, subscribe, hit the bell notification, whatever it is you want to do. There'll be more Ruby on Rails tips coming, and probably some entrepreneur tips coming as well, doing that soon. And covering all different aspects of Ruby on Rails, back end, front end, and the bit in the middle. Thanks for now. See you soon.